What defines a human? We're hairless apes, obviously. Bipedal, good at running, at least some of us are. We have sophisticated language, not just one language, but hundreds, maybe thousands, depending on how you define it. We're obligate tool users, basically can't accomplish anything without them. We're creative, and we've spread across the entire globe. I believe we can trace all of these features back to owners of skulls like this one. This is Sangiran 17, or at least a plastic copy of it that I'm holding here. It was excavated on the island of Java in Indonesia, and it belonged to someone who lived about 1.5 million years ago. Today we call these hominins Homo erectus. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's why I make them. So subscribe maybe, tell me where you're at and the time. Comments are like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. In my opinion, they're the first hominins who truly deserve to be called human. From their biology to their technology, their globe-spanning reach, maybe even artistic and linguistic abilities, these chaps and chapettes were an absolutely huge leap forward in human evolution, and today I just want to break down what it is that's so special about them, why I think they are the first true humans. Homo erectus is a really well-studied fossil specimen, but despite that, its origins remain basically unclear. After a major glaciation 2.5 million years ago, there were multiple species of early Homo and Australopithecus that all overlapped in time in East Africa, but the identities of these species are still debated. Homo habilis has been considered for a long time the first in our genus Homo because it was found with stone tools, but some anthropologists think it's actually too primitive to really be in our genus, to really be Homo, and is more likely some sort of Australopithecus. Homo rudolfensis seems to be a larger version of habilis, but whether or not it's a distinct species is still up for debate as well. Most anthropologists recognize habilis and rudolfensis as being distinct, but because it's still debated, it's easier just to call them both early Homo. With the separation between Australopithecines and early Homo still kind of unclear, it's hard to know exactly when and where Homo erectus originated. The oldest Homo erectus fossil that the scientific community agrees upon are around 1.9 million years old and come from Kubifora in Kenya, overlapping in time with both habilis and rudolfensis. But one of the most famous early Homo erectus fossils actually comes from outside of Africa, from Georgia, and dates to 1.8 million years ago. Incredible, really old. This showed that Homo erectus had made long migrations out of Africa very shortly after it evolved, and that it didn't need a big brain to do it. It really was an incredible discovery. Whoa, steady on, I hear you say. Small brains? Stefan, these are supposed to be the first humans. What are we if not, big walking brains? Well, within the species that we call Homo erectus, there's actually a ton of variation. They lived for 1.8 million years across 3 continents. There's so much variation that you might find them referred to as different species, like Homo ergaster. We're gonna ignore that convention today. It's perfectly acceptable to lump them all in as Homo erectus. Despite this variation and this huge time span that they were around, there are some key uniting features that we can point to as definitively erectus. Compared to early Homo and Australopithecines, they had larger bodies, smaller teeth, smaller jaws, but the first major change were these big brains. Early erectus, who we could call Homo ergaster, like the ones found in Dmanisi, Georgia only had a brain size of about 540 cubic centimeters, bigger than a chimpanzee, but not by a lot. If we compare that to erectuses like Sangiran 17, that lived 500,000 years later in Indonesia, they had brain sizes of about 1,200 cubic centimeters. To put that into perspective, a modern Homo sapiens, like me or you, might have a brain size of around 1350 cubic centimeters. So within that 500,000 years, they had basically tripled to modern levels. That's huge. That's really significant. Erectus was also the first hominin that had the ability to run. We can tell this from their short, bowl-shaped pelvises. Mathematical models indicate that they may have been able to run for 5 hours straight, which is way beyond my abilities in my current state. Obviously, you can't run that long if you're covered in hair. It's kind of hard. Interestingly, studies of our genetics have shown that the genes for dark skin evolved around 1.2 million years ago, meaning that our skin had been exposed to the sun by then. So Erectus was almost certainly the first kind of hairless hominin. These traits are obviously abundant across the entire world, across our entire species, so you might be inclined to think, yawn fest, big deal, but in reality it would be hard to underestimate their importance. Together, all these things signal major changes to the morpho-behavioral package that Homo erectus had. Homo erectus didn't just look like an upright walking chimpanzee. They would have looked much more like us. They would have walked further to get their food, and the food they were eating was much higher quality to fuel this huge brain expansion. Erectus wasn't just an upright walking ape, they'd have lived a lifestyle that was familiar to humanity for the rest of the Paleolithic. It's obviously difficult for us to say exactly how Homo erectus went about hunting animals, but we can tell from the bones that they left behind and the marks on them that they were getting primary access to the most nutritionally dense parts of the animal. They weren't just scavenging, and that these were big animals too, really big animals like hippos and giraffes, things like that. So however they went about it, they were certainly capable of some pretty advanced hunting skills. Now, running and hunting is all well and good, definitely a major leap forward in our evolution, but a defining feature of our morpho-behavioral package as Homo sapiens is language. So could Homo erectus talk? That's kind of a difficult question to answer. For language to exist, of course, there needs to be certain biological preconditions that have to be met. The first would be larger brains, which, as we've discussed later, Erectus certainly had, but just because it's big doesn't mean it's wired correctly for language. You also need the brain to function at a much higher cognitive level. Now, believe it or not, the guy sat in his garage talking to a spoon is not Mr. Brain Scientist, but according to the source in the description, the evolution of genes srgap2c and srgap2d, I had to look at my notes there for that one. These genes in the lab were associated with higher brain connectivity. Intriguingly, it seems that these genes evolved at the same time Erectus appeared in the archaeological record. Now, I'm not saying Erectus had a language as complicated as ours, far from it, but like all things, language is a trait that we have evolved to have. It's unlikely that it appeared fully formed just in us Homo sapiens. It's not unreasonable to think that the building blocks of language could be found in Homo erectus, that they had some sort of linguistic capability, maybe some sort of sophisticated sign language, say. I don't know. It's hard to say for sure, because words and gestures aren't preserved in the archaeological record, but if we look at the tools they left behind, the technology they left behind, it certainly indicates that these chaps and chapettes were very smart indeed. The technology that Homo erectus is most known for, and one which likely gave them a distinct evolutionary advantage, is fire. The main idea is that earlier hominins spent a ton of time and energy digesting raw meat and difficult-to-eat foods. It's why the Australopiths have such thick, sturdy jaws. But once we developed fire, it did much of this work for us. It allowed our guts to take it easier and our brains to absorb that extra energy, allowing them to grow to the size that they are now. This is a great theory. It's a very nice theory. There's a serious problem with it, though, in that the earliest evidence for controlled fire that most archaeologists would agree with is only 780,000 years old from Israel, much later than when we see big brains appear in the fossil record. Earlier possible sites are being unearthed, such as Kubi Fora in Kenya, which could push back the evidence for controlled fire use to 1.5 million years ago. The only problem is that it's just difficult to say for sure. Humans don't have a monopoly on starting fires. They can occur perfectly naturally on their own. Considering the sparse evidence for deliberate fire use, it does raise interesting questions about how they expanded into new territories, colder territories. How did they do this? Oof made jump then. How did they do this without fire to keep them warm? Perhaps they huddled together. Perhaps they had some form of rudimentary clothing. Perhaps both of those things. Perhaps neither. Maybe our ancestors weren't even cooking with fire at all. Analysis of soils from Olduvai Gorge, dated to around 1.7 million years ago, suggest that the area might have had natural hot springs. This led the investigators to wonder, what role did this hot water play in our evolution? Instead of roasting meats and plants and seeds, were we boiling them instead? I absolutely love this idea. I can't help but compare it to those Japanese monkeys that live around those hot springs. Just imagining like an ancient Homo erectus sitting in the hot spring, chilling, just having an absolutely fantastic time the same way that you or I would. It's so humanizing. I hope that was how our evolution went down, that we evolved in hot tubs. I really hope that. Whilst we're on the subject, there is another big debate around Homo erectus and water. Now obviously Homo erectus, or the hominins that left Africa, didn't do it consciously. They were almost certainly just following animals, taking advantage of ecological niches that they could fill, just following their food, and as a result they passively spread across the world. But they may have genuinely made some more deliberate migrations over in Southeast Asia. Recently, a new hominin has been found on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and a few years ago, stone tools dated to around 700,000 years ago were also found in the Philippines. What's so special about these discoveries is that the islands of the Philippines were islands when this was going on. There is no plausible way a hominin could have walked to these islands. At the very least, they would have had a short sea crossing of a few miles. Though I actually haven't been able to find out exactly how far, but a few miles. So the debate is now, of course, how did these hominins get there? Was it accidental? Were they swept up in some sort of tsunami? Or was it deliberate? Did they deliberately set out to cross these few miles of sea and exploit a new territory? This is something we'll come back to because it has huge implications for their cognitive abilities. This is a Paleolithic hand axe, a Culean hand axe, not plastic this time. This is real stone. The evolution of Homo erectus coincides with the sudden appearance of this new type of tool in the archaeological record. Although it appears simple, this is actually a giant leap forward for humankind. Before this, hominins were producing Oldowan-style tools, and they seemingly, when they made those, made no effort to shape the core of the tool. They simply produced a cutting edge, and that was it. Acheulean tools, on the other hand, were flaked on both sides. It was a real revolution, and as you can see, it required the removal of a lot of flakes to get it into this nice shape. Even a simple one might remove 20 or 30 flakes, something like that. This really shows a degree of creative thinking on the part of Homo erectus, to be able to take a rock and visualize and understand that through this process of napping, through many steps, this hand axe was inside it. It's quite frankly ingenious, very intelligent indeed, shows an absolutely remarkable degree of creative thinking that is unique to our genus. Acheulean hand axes probably did not have one single purpose. They must have been used to hunt. They were certainly used to butcher, I'm sure, and perhaps even work wood and bone. They're really the original Swiss Army knife. These things are very heavy. You could certainly butcher an animal with this. You could certainly kill something with it, no doubt about that. How much Homo erectus worked with wood and bone is difficult to say. The oldest wooden spears that have been found so far are the 500,000-year-old or so Schoningen spears, which really have just survived in the archaeological record through sheer luck and fluke. They were probably produced by a Neanderthal or proto-Neanderthal, but it is within the same time span as Homo erectus, and I personally believe erectus would have been more than capable of producing something similar. If you can take 20 or 30 steps to turn a rock into a hand axe, for sure you can sharpen a stick, in my opinion. As for bone tools, again, the record is sparse, but it's not incomplete. Some of the most distinctive come from Olduvai Gorge and include this absolutely stunning potential barbed point. Now that is really incredible. If Homo erectus did produce this tool, and evidence suggests they did, then that again is an absolutely brilliant example of their intelligence. If producing tools and working with tools is a sign of humanity, is a defining feature of ours, then for sure Homo erectus was in the human club, no doubt about it. Oh bloody hell, my legs are so stiff. Bloody hell. Out of all of the defining features I've mentioned today, producing art is probably the most defining out of all of them. No other animal produces art quite like us Homo sapiens. So if I'm trying to decide if Homo erectus was a human or not, whether they produced art is key to that. The best and perhaps only example of creative expression by a Homo erectus hominin is this shell found in Java. The layer containing the shell was dated to between 500 and 400,000 years ago, roughly, so there's absolutely no question it's in the time span of Homo erectus, not Homo sapiens, and as you can see, someone has drawn some lines on it. They've scratched lines into the shell. Do these simple lines count as a creative expression, as a symbolic act, or are they just a careless moment by some ancient hominin? In my opinion, it doesn't matter. It's incredible either way. As with language, our artistic expression is also something that I believe we've learned, that we've evolved to do, and the seeds of all this creativity that we see around us every single day may have begun with just a simple careless act. A slip of the hand scratched a shell, and maybe that scratch caught the eye of the hominin that did it, and they did another and another and another. In my personal opinion, just these simple acts could have been the spark, could have connected a couple of neurons in the brain that weren't connected before and led to absolutely all the beautiful things we see around us today. Not bad if I do say so myself. Eat your heart out, Ettore. There's a new artist in town. Now, something totally blew my mind when I first learned about it. Just recently in 2025, archaeologists made this incredible discovery off the coast of Java in Indonesia. They were doing dredging operations in the Madura Strait, just normal marine construction stuff, when they found over 6,000 fossilized remains from 36 different vertebrate species. And buried in all that were 2 Homo erectus skull fragments dating to about 140,000 years ago. These fossils came from what used to be a massive lowland called Sunderland that's now completely underwater. When sea levels were lower during ice ages, this area connected Java to mainland Asia, and Homo erectus was living there, hunting water buffalo, eating water turtles, basically thriving in this incredible river valley ecosystem. The cool thing about these discoveries is they show cut marks on turtle bones and broken buffalo bones that suggest active hunting, not just scavenging. Earlier Homo erectus populations in Java didn't show this kind of sophisticated hunting behavior, so either these later erectus populations invented new techniques or, and this is kind of wild, they learned them from more modern human populations that had moved into Asia. Different human species potentially teaching each other hunting strategies. I mean, that's just fascinating. Everywhere we find Erectus, we see that it lived for a really long time. Its fossil record spans almost 2 million years, from sort of that 2 million year mark in Ethiopia to 117,000 years ago in Java, Indonesia. So what caused Erectus to meet its ultimate demise? Again, we're not 100% sure, but it's likely that the changing climate played a part. For example, in Indonesia, the woodlands were rapidly becoming rainforest as we know it today, and as the conditions became hotter and more humid, maybe Erectus couldn't adapt to the changing climate there. Erectus's legacy has lived on though. As it travelled the globe, it may have left behind populations that eventually evolved into new species through isolation. One prime candidate is Homo floresiensis, found on the island of Flores in Indonesia. The fossils that we found so far date to between 700,000 and 70,000 years ago, which in the scheme of human evolution in prehistory is really recent. I mean, this is the only chapter of human history where we go 70,000 years. It's so recent, but it's true that is very recent. The adults seemingly were only 1 metre tall, which has led to them being nicknamed the hobbits. Different studies have arrived at different conclusions. Most would probably say that Floresiensis descended from Erectus and experienced a phenomenon we call island dwarfism. Not everyone agrees, though. Others would argue that they probably derive from an even earlier unknown species just due to some primitive traits that they have. Maybe some form of Australopithecus actually made it out of Africa. Considering the fact that we know Homo erectus was in that region for a very long time, they are the most plausible ancestor, but the fact that Floresiensis probably suffered from island dwarfism does suggest that if Erectus was able to travel across water, and I believe they did, they could not do it habitually, they couldn't just choose to do it any time they wanted. Otherwise they could have just upped and left, they could have got resources from somewhere else. This pressure towards dwarfism would not have been so pronounced. The really weird Homo naledi has been proposed as a potential Erectus descendant. I've also made a video on those guys, check it out. Naledi was found deep in a South African cave in 2013, and so far 15 individuals were recovered just within one single cave chamber. Tres mysterious. While we don't know for sure if Erectus is their direct ancestor, it's a solid bet given the temporal ranges overlapping and the really modern features that Naledi has, which just aren't present in early Homo or Australopiths. We are pretty confident, though, that Erectus gave rise to at least 3 species, us Neanderthals and Denisovans. The identity of the last common ancestor between us Neanderthals and Denisovans is still highly debated. We know that an ancestor was Erectus, they're certainly on our family tree, but did we descend directly from it? Some, a minority, but some anthropologists think so. One theory, called the multi-regional hypothesis, argues that despite the huge geographic distance between Homo erectus, it could have sort of simultaneously evolved into Homo sapiens across the globe through continuous gene flow. As I said, that is definitely the minority opinion at the minute. Let me add a little bit more information as to why that is, because some of you might be thinking, now that we know that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, that the multi-regional hypothesis is therefore correct, and, yes and no is basically the answer to that. Because of that genetic research, we now know that human evolution took place in multiple regions, Africa, Europe, and Asia. So in that sense, our evolution is multi-regional. But specifically, the multi-regional hypothesis gave no special place to Africa, but what the fossil record and the genetic evidence suggests is that we are still predominantly an African species. Most of our evolution took place there, but it didn't happen exclusively there. There were very small amounts of absorption, you could say, of other archaic hominins. It's just really about the degree of how much interbreeding happened, not that much in the grand scheme of things. Others think that there might have been an intermediate species. The argument is that Erectus that stayed in Africa evolved into a species called Homo heidelbergensis sometime around 800,000 years ago, roughly. Homo heidelbergensis then also migrated out of Africa. The ones who stayed in Africa evolved into Homo sapiens, and the ones that made it to Europe and Asia evolved into Neanderthals and Denisovans. The exact nature of all of the relationships between these various species is not clear, and this debate is famously called the muddle in the middle. Fla-la-la-la-la. It's taken me so many takes to say that, because it's just so difficult to solve. There aren't that many fossils that we've found that date to that crucial time period of sort of 800 to 500,000 years ago, and each time we do find one, in that very rare event, it just complicates the picture further. It's just difficult to say. It's difficult to talk with any certainty about complicated events that happened 500,000 to 1 million years ago. Naturally, that's just a difficult thing to do. I'd love to finish this video with an analogy. Whenever we see chimpanzees or gorillas playing, interacting as a family, we can't help but see ourselves in them. Their mannerisms, their expressions, their games, it's just all too familiar to us. Now imagine we could travel back in time 1 million years to some cave in Indonesia and watch a family of erectuses sitting around a fire, cooking, making tools, laughing, maybe even talking. We would certainly recognize them as human. Their relationship to us, their inherent humanity, would be obvious. Despite all the differences between us, despite the huge amount of time they would be unmistakably human, you could say that there's a little erectus in all of us. But seriously, understanding Homo erectus changes how we think about ourselves, because for the last 300,000 years or so, we Homo sapiens have been the only human species on the planet. But that's not normal. For most of the last 2 million years, there were multiple human species coexisting. Homo erectus in Asia, early Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Siberia, Floresiensis on islands, Naledi in caves. The world was full of different kinds of humans. And they weren't just existing in their own separate bubbles. Recent evidence suggests they were interacting, trading maybe, fighting possibly, definitely interbreeding in some cases. The genetic evidence is clear on that. Non-African modern humans have about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations have Denisovan DNA. We're literally carrying pieces of these other human species inside us. This completely changes the narrative about human evolution. It's not a straight line from ape to human. It's a bushy tree with tons of branches, most of which went extinct, but not before leaving their mark on us. Homo erectus is the trunk of that tree. Everything else branched off from them. Now I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. Homo erectus emotions. Yeah, I know that sounds weird. How can we possibly know what they felt? We can't directly, but we can make some pretty educated guesses based on their behavior and their biology. They took care of their elderly and sick. That requires empathy, compassion, a sense of social obligation. The old man from Dmanisi with no teeth, someone was taking care of him, feeding him soft foods, keeping him alive when he couldn't fend for himself. That's love. That's humanity. They buried their dead, maybe. The evidence is controversial, but there are some Homo erectus sites where the bodies seem to have been deliberately placed. If that's true, it means they had concepts of death, of ritual, of honouring the deceased. Those are deeply emotional, deeply human behaviours. They made art, or at least they made marks on shells that might have been art. Even if it was just absent-minded doodling, that shows a mind that wanders, that sees patterns, that plays with ideas. That's imagination, that's creativity. They probably had language of some form, maybe not as complex as ours, but some way of sharing information, coordinating hunts, teaching their children, telling stories maybe. Language is fundamentally about connection. It's about building relationships, sharing experiences, creating culture. If erectus had even rudimentary language, they had rich social lives, complex emotional bonds. Think about a Homo erectus teenager. Yeah, they had teenagers, they grew up faster than we do, but there was still a period between childhood and adulthood. Imagine that teenager testing boundaries, trying to impress their peers, falling in love for the first time, worrying about their place in the group. All the universal human experiences of adolescence, they probably felt those too. Think about a Homo erectus parent watching their child take their first steps or make their first tool or bring home their first successful hunt. Pride, joy, fear for their safety, hope for their future. Those emotions don't require modern brains or complex language. They're hardwired into mammalian parenting, and Homo erectus was definitely a good parent species based on how successful they were at raising children to adulthood. Think about the terror of facing a charging hippo with nothing but stone tools and wooden spears, the adrenaline, the fear, but also the courage to stand your ground because your family needs to eat. Think about the exhaustion after a 5-hour persistence hunt, but the triumph and relief when you finally bring down that antelope. Think about the comfort of sitting around a fire, warm and fed and safe, surrounded by your family and friends. Homo erectus felt all of that. They were human in every way that matters. They loved, they feared, they hoped, they grieved, they celebrated. They weren't primitive brutes shambling through prehistory. They were people, complex, emotional, intelligent people living full lives in a world that was simultaneously more dangerous and more beautiful than anything we experience today. And honestly, that should humble us. We like to think we're special, we're unique, we're the pinnacle of evolution, but Homo erectus was doing just fine without smartphones or cities or the internet. They had everything that actually matters for a good life. Strong social bonds, meaningful work, connection to the natural world, a sense of purpose and belonging. What have we gained in the 300,000 years since we evolved from them? Technology, sure. Longer lifespans, better medicine, more comfortable lives. But have we gained more happiness, more fulfillment, more meaning? I'm not sure we have. Homo erectus lived for nearly 2 million years. That's not just survival, that's success. They figured out a way of life that was sustainable, fulfilling, adaptable. They spread across 3 continents and thrived in environments from tropical forests to temperate woodlands to semi-deserts. They raised their children successfully for thousands of generations. They maintained their culture and passed down their knowledge without writing or schools or the internet. We've been at this Homo sapiens thing for 300,000 years, and we've only had civilization for 10,000. We're babies compared to erectus, and we're already facing existential threats that we created ourselves. Climate change, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, biodiversity loss. Homo erectus never did that. They lived in balance with their environment. They took what they needed, but didn't destroy the ecosystems they depended on. Maybe that's the real lesson of Homo erectus. Being human isn't about having the biggest brain or the most advanced technology. Being human is about taking care of each other, about adapting to challenges, about living sustainably, about finding meaning and joy in simple things. About building communities that last not just for decades or centuries, but for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus understood that. They lived it every day, and we forgot it somewhere along the way. But it's not too late to remember. We carry their genes, their adaptations, their potential inside us. Every human alive today is a direct descendant of Homo erectus. We are them, just with some updates. The foundation is still there. The capacity for resilience, for cooperation, for sustainable living, for finding happiness without needing stuff, that's all still in us because it was in them. So, when you look at that plastic skull or that stone hand axe, you're not looking at some primitive extinct species. You're looking at your ancestor, your very successful, very human, very admirable ancestor who survived and thrived for nearly 2 million years and gave you the gift of being human. That's worth honouring. That's worth learning from. That's worth carrying forward. Now I want to address something that might be bugging you. If Homo erectus was so successful, why aren't they still around? What killed them off after nearly 2 million years? The answer is complicated, and honestly we don't fully know. Different erectus populations died out at different times for different reasons. The last confirmed Homo erectus fossils come from Java, from a site called Ngandong, dated to between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. That's incredibly recent. Modern humans were already walking around, Neanderthals were in Europe, and erectus was still hanging on in Indonesia. So what happened to the Java populations? Best guess is climate change. The environment was shifting from open woodlands and savannas to dense tropical rainforest. Hotter, more humid, different food sources, different challenges. Maybe erectus just couldn't adapt fast enough this time. After nearly 2 million years of successful adaptation, they finally hit an environmental change they couldn't handle. But here's the thing, erectus didn't really go extinct. They transformed, they evolved into other species. Some populations became Homo heidelbergensis. Some of those became Neanderthals and Denisovans. Others became us, Homo sapiens. Erectus's genes didn't disappear. They just got remixed and updated. Think of it like this. Your great-great-grandfather isn't around anymore, but he's not really gone either. He's in you. His genes, his adaptations, his traits, they're all still here, just expressed in a new generation. That's what happened with erectus. They're not extinct. They're ancestral. There's a difference. And some erectus populations, the ones that got isolated on islands, evolved in really bizarre directions. Homo floresiensis, those hobbit humans, they're probably descended from erectus. They got stuck on Flores Island, and over hundreds of thousands of years they evolved smaller bodies and smaller brains. Island dwarfism. It's a well-known phenomenon, but it's still wild to think about a human species deliberately evolving to be tiny because the island couldn't support large populations. And they survived until at least 50,000 years ago, maybe even more recently. There were 3-foot-tall humans with chimp-sized brains hunting pygmy elephants on an Indonesian island, while modern humans were in Africa creating art and jewellery and complex tools. That's insane. The diversity of human evolution is just staggering. Then there's Homo naledi, those weird humans found deep in a South African cave. Small brains, weird mix of primitive and modern features, possibly burying their dead. They might be erectus descendants that got isolated somehow and evolved along their own strange path. We're still figuring out their story. The point is, Erectus didn't have one ending. They had multiple endings, multiple evolutionary branches, most of which eventually went extinct, but not before doing their own thing for hundreds of thousands of years. That's the real story of human evolution. It's not one species marching forward through time. It's multiple species branching off, experimenting with different body plans and brain sizes and survival strategies, most failing eventually, but all contributing to the total diversity of what it means to be human. And then there's us, Homo sapiens, the last ones standing, the sole surviving branch of the human family tree. We evolved in Africa somewhere between 300 and 200,000 years ago, probably from a population of Homo heidelbergensis or something similar, with a youngest, newest version of human with a latest experiment. And we don't know yet if we're going to be successful. We've been around for 300,000 years, which sounds like a long time, but it's nothing compared to Erectus's nearly 2 million years. We've only had civilization for 10,000 years. We've only had industrial society for 200 years. We're so new, so untested by deep time. Are we going to last? Are we going to match Erectus's record, or are we just a brief, brilliant flash that burns out quickly? Because right now, we're not doing great. Climate change, environmental destruction, nuclear weapons, biodiversity loss, we're creating existential threats faster than we're solving them. Erectus never did that. They lived sustainably for 2 million years without destroying their environment. They adapted to challenges without creating new ones. They thrived without needing constant growth and consumption. What's our excuse? We have bigger brains than Erectus. We have more complex language, more sophisticated tools, more accumulated knowledge. We have science and medicine and technology, and yet we're struggling to do what Erectus did easily, live in balance with our planet. Maybe intelligence isn't enough. Maybe survival requires more than just being smart. Maybe it requires wisdom, restraint, long-term thinking, genuine care for future generations, things that Erectus seemed to have figured out and we're still working on. I'm not trying to romanticize Erectus or say we should go back to living in caves. Technology is great. Modern medicine is great. I like not dying from infected wounds or childbirth or bad water, but we can learn from Erectus's success. We can study what worked for them and see if we can adapt those lessons to our modern context. Sustainability, community, taking care of each other, living within our means, passing down knowledge and culture, adapting to change without destroying what we depend on. These aren't primitive ideas. These are sophisticated survival strategies that kept Erectus alive for 2 million years. If we want to match that record, if we want to be good ancestors to whoever comes after us, we need to remember those lessons. We need to think longer term than the next quarterly earnings report or election cycle. We need to care about what happens 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, 100,000 years from now. Because that's the timescale that matters for a species. That's the timescale Erectus operated on. And if we can't think that way, if we can't plan for that kind of future, we're not going to make it. The good news is we have the capacity. We're descended from Erectus. Their adaptability, their resilience, their social bonds, their problem-solving abilities, all of that is still in us. We just need to access it. We need to remember who we are and where we came from. We're not separate from nature. We're not above evolution. We're not the pinnacle of anything. We're just the latest chapter in a very long story that started with Erectus 2 million years ago, and that story is still being written. The ending isn't decided yet. So what kind of ancestors do we want to be? Do we want to be the generation that figured it out, that turned things around, that built a sustainable civilization that could last for hundreds of thousands of years? Or do we want to be the generation that had everything and squandered it? Erectus gives us a blueprint. They showed us it's possible. They proved that humans can thrive for millions of years without destroying everything. Now we just have to choose to follow that example. We have to decide that long-term survival matters more than short-term gain, that community matters more than individual accumulation, that the future matters more than the present. If we can do that, if we can embody the best qualities of Erectus while keeping the benefits of modern knowledge and technology, we might actually make it. We might become good ancestors. We might last long enough to see what comes next in human evolution, whatever that is. And wouldn't that be something, to know that 2 million years from now, there are still humans, whatever form they take, looking back at us the way we look back at Erectus, with respect, with gratitude, with recognition that we gave them the tools and knowledge and genes they needed to survive. That's the legacy Erectus left us. That's the responsibility we carry. And that's the challenge we face. Can we rise to it? Can we be worthy of Erectus's gift? Can we pay it forward? I hope so. I really do. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya. Just kidding, I'm not done yet. There's one more thing I want to talk about. This whole journey into Homo erectus, learning about who they were and what they accomplished, it's changed how I see humanity. And I think if you've stuck with me this far, it's probably changed how you see it too. Because we tend to think of human history as this short thing, right? Civilization is 5,000 years old, agriculture is 10,000 years old, modern humans are 300,000 years old. Those are the numbers we hear, but the real human story, the deep human story, starts 2 million years ago with Erectus. 2 million years. Try to wrap your head around that. It's impossible, really. 2 million years ago, there was no writing, no agriculture, no cities, no technology as we understand it. But there were humans, people living and loving and struggling and succeeding. Generation after generation after generation for so long that the total number of lives lived is uncountable. Every one of those people was a full person. They weren't primitive or simple or less than us. They had hopes and dreams and fears just like we do. They watched sunsets. They told stories around fires. They held their children. They grieved their dead. They laughed with their friends. They fell in love. They wondered about the stars. 2 million years of that. 2 million years of fully human experience. All of it lost now except for the bones and stones they left behind. No names, no faces, no voices, just faint echoes in the archaeological record. And yet they're not really gone, because we're here. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're the continuation of their story. We're the unbroken chain connecting back to that first Homo erectus who walked upright on the plains of Africa 2 million years ago. Think about that chain, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, going back and back and back through thousands of generations, each one successfully raising a child to adulthood, each one passing on genes and knowledge and culture, an unbroken line of mothers stretching back 2 million years to Erectus. That's your lineage. That's what made you possible. The same is true for everyone. Every human who has ever lived is part of that same chain. We're all connected, all related, all descended from the same small population of Erectus that left Africa and spread across the world. That should change how we see each other. We're not separate races or nations or tribes. We're one family, one species, one continuous story. The artificial divisions we create, the borders and barriers and categories, they're all superficial. Deep down, we're all the same. We're all carrying Erectus's genes, Erectus's adaptations, Erectus's legacy. And that's a heavy responsibility, because we're the only ones left. All those other human species, gone. Erectus, heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Floresiensis, Naledi, all extinct. We're the last branch on the tree, the sole survivors, and that means we're responsible for carrying the story forward. What kind of story are we writing? Are we honouring the legacy of Erectus, those successful survivors who thrived for 2 million years, or are we squandering it? Are we living up to the potential they gave us, or are we wasting it? I don't have answers. Nobody does. But I think asking the questions is important. Because the decisions we make now, today, in our lifetimes, they're going to determine whether the human story continues or ends. Climate change, environmental destruction, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, we're facing challenges that no previous generation of humans ever faced. Erectus never had to worry about accidentally destroying the entire planet. They never had the power to end all human life. We do. And that's terrifying, but it's also empowering, because it means we have agency, we have choice. The future isn't predetermined. We get to decide what happens next. Every action we take, every choice we make, every value we prioritize, it all matters. It's all part of writing the next chapter of the human story. So what should we do? How do we honor Erectus? How do we become good ancestors ourselves? I think it starts with remembering where we came from, with understanding that we're not separate from nature, we're part of it, with recognizing that we're connected to every other human, every other living thing, every generation that came before, and every generation that will come after. It continues with valuing the right things, not money or power or status, but relationships and community and sustainability, not short-term gain, but long-term survival, not individual success, but collective thriving. And it ends with taking action, making changes in our own lives, supporting policies that prioritize the future over the present, building systems and institutions that can last not just decades, but centuries, millennia, hundreds of thousands of years. That's the challenge Erectus left us. That's the test we face. Can we think on that timescale? Can we plan for that kind of future? Can we be the ancestors that our descendants will honour and remember and thank? I hope so. Because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is being the generation that had everything and threw it away. The generation that could have saved the world and chose not to. The generation that ended the human story after 2 million years because we couldn't think beyond our own lifetimes. I don't want that to be our legacy. I don't think you do either. So let's choose differently. Let's choose to honour Erectus by learning from them, by embodying their sustainability, their resilience, their long-term thinking, by taking care of each other and the planet that gave us life. Let's choose to be good ancestors, to build a future worth inheriting, to write a chapter of the human story that future generations will be proud of, to prove that Homo sapiens can match Homo erectus's success, can thrive for millions of years without destroying everything. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. But it's possible. We have everything we need. The intelligence, the knowledge, the technology, the resources. We have Erectus's genes, Erectus's adaptations, Erectus's proven survival strategies. We have each other, 8 billion humans, all descended from the same ancestors, all part of the same family. If we can remember that, if we can act on it, if we can choose the long term over the short term, community over individual, sustainability over exploitation, we can do this. We can survive, we can thrive, we can build a civilization that lasts not just centuries, but hundreds of thousands of years. And 2 million years from now, Maybe there will be humans, whatever they look like by then, studying our fossils, examining our artifacts, trying to understand who we were and how we lived, and maybe they'll look at our bones and our tools and our art and say, yeah, those were humans, real humans. They understood what matters. They honoured their ancestors. They became good ancestors themselves. That's the dream. That's the goal. That's what Homo erectus challenges us to achieve. Can we do it? I believe we can. I believe we will, because we're human, and humans, real humans, the kind of humans Erectus was and taught us to be, we don't give up, we adapt, we overcome, we survive, we thrive. That's who we are. That's who we've always been. That's who we'll always be, if we choose to remember it. So here's to Homo erectus, the first true humans, the most successful human species ever, our ancestors, our teachers, our inspiration. May we live up to their example. May we honour their legacy. May we become worthy of the gift they gave us, the gift of being human.